So I'd like to introduce Sadie-Jade Fouracre Reynolds, who is an EAP practitioner from Swansea University. And she's been working at Swansea University for 2 decades. Is that right, Sadie? Or you've been working as a language teacher for 2 decades and has a background in science. She's worked in a wide range of contexts, including EAP, ESOL, EAL, and CLIL. And she's very experienced teacher, course developer, material creator, and an outreach project manager. And this has fed into her work with vulnerable communities and development of teacher support and mentoring programs. So we're really pleased to have her here with us today to share her experience of setting up ESOL classes for local refugee background students through her university. So over to you, Jade.
Fab, thanks, Alex. I'm just going to do the sharing thing just to make sure that everybody can see what they need to be able to see and make it nice and shiny big. There we go. Fab. Okay. Yeah, so thanks everybody for coming along to have a listen about this sort of stuff, really. As you probably saw on the flyer, it's kind of connected to a blog that I wrote for the RefugEAP website as it was starting up. And so some of you may have had a chance to have a look, some of you won't. So I'm based at Swansea University at the moment, and we've been working for sort of the past 7 or 8 years on community outreach, ESOL and EFL language provision. So what I'll do today is I'm going to start off with kind of the background to how the project started and how we managed to access a little bit of funding. And then we'll have a look at how a specific ESOL focused element of the project ran and worked and what we've kind of learned from that and the successes that came with that and the challenges as well. So we'll start with the shape of the project and what it kind of looks like where we are. I know that the kind of landscape in different areas of the UK can be slightly different. So specifically, we're in South Wales at the moment. So funding tends to work slightly differently for us, but hopefully, even if you're not in the same space, you can kind of take some takeaways from this. I am also going to aim to not talk about this for more than about 20 minutes, because I know we want to do the discussion bit at the end, and I could talk about this for a very long time. So we'll try and keep it contained. Okay, so we'll talk about kind of current ESOL provision frameworks and the ways that we've worked with the local community to identify needs and areas that we can kind of help as a university, and then maybe a different approach that we took and what that looked like and what we're hoping it'll look like in the future as well. So just a quick overview then of what ESOL provision in Swansea looks like at the moment and in that Swansea area. This is probably familiar to quite a few of you. It's sort of representative of most areas, as I said. So you've got the mainstream provision on one side, where it's largely government funded. We've got trusted providers that are selected specifically to provide ESOL provision. It's exam board accredited. There's formal teaching and there's very fixed modes of delivery. And that's kind of, in my experience at least, that's been fairly fixed for quite a number of years now. I was an ESOL teacher up in the Northeast about 15 years ago, and that kind of FE model of ESOL provision looks very much the same as it did. There's some sort of adaptations to teaching methodology, but largely it looks the same. So learners come in at a kind of, sometimes pre-entry, but you're hoping kind of entry 1 level, they're beginners. And through each level, it takes an academic year. So you do entry 1, you do entry 2, you do entry 3, etc. Then you level 1, level 2s. In addition to that, I think in most particularly big cities or that kind of area, but we're finding even a need for this in rural areas as well. We've got the third sector provision, which is kind of filling gaps because I don't know what it's like with you, but with us, the waiting lists for ESOL places are quite high with trusted providers. So in Swansea, we have Gower College, but we also have Adult Learning Wales, who are a trusted provider. And they do an amazing job as well, because they're kind of filling gaps. They work with a slightly different exam board. It's a little bit more modular, so it's a little bit more flexible, but still trying to fill gaps where there's a need for provision that doesn't exist, or that there's just too highly subscribed. So we've got the sector coming in, we've got charities who are working, they're usually non-accredited. You get a mixture there, so it's really well-meaning provision, and it's quite nice for people to access, but it's very varied, and students don't always manage to get the accreditation that they want that'll get them to where they need to be as well. So it's kind of stopgap. So that's kind of where it looks at the moment. And in Swansea, we've got a kind of a steering group where we're trying to get together all of the different providers and types of providers to see if we can identify gaps in various places. We also have something called Reach Plus in Wales. Started off in Cardiff, it's now in Wrexham and Swansea as well. And the idea there is it's FE College led, but there's a place that you can send all ESOL learners, and then they can signpost to provision as fitting and as necessary. Just trying to really list the learners that we have, so that, because if we don't know who we've got, then we don't know what provision is needed. So that's an attempt there. Obviously, with that kind of fixed provision that's going to get you the accreditation and the certificates that learners want and need to progress, there's a lot of barriers to access. So I've got this very short list up on the screen, and I feel like if we opened a breakout room now and just allowed people to chat for about 5 minutes, we could probably quadruple the number of things that are on this list. And it's a conversation that will just keep going and going, but there are so many different barriers to people accessing the sort of mainstream standard provision, as good as it is. If you've got fixed class times, if you've got fixed spaces that you have to get to, if you've got a very sort of formal structure that you're working within, then, you know, there are issues that are going to prevent people from accessing learning in the way that you'd like. Also, we're kind of limited, and colleges are limited in the same way that universities are limited by funding and by, you know, people above us as sort of a wider organization saying, okay, but we're putting money into this. We want to be able to see that we're getting results and that learners are consistent. And that's not always possible in the way that we want it to look. So we've just been trying to figure out ways that we can kind of try and help a little bit, and then maybe utilize the resources at the university in a way that helps to fill some gaps, basically. So yes, short list. We will add to it, I'm sure, later. So this is what things look like as part of the ELTS community project. So ELTS is the language centre at Swansea, stands for English Language Training Services. And this is where we do all of the kind of work with international students when they're coming in. So as a department, we largely work with EAP learners. We also have a general English programme. And we have a teacher training programme. So a very brief history on this is anybody who has ever done a CELTA or worked on training in a CELTA environment knows that in order to have trainee teachers learn, you need some trainee learners. And so we have volunteer learners come in, and they would be the learners for the trainee teachers who are learning. And about 8 years ago now, we had a group of young Syrian men come in, all early 20s, had just arrived in Swansea, really wanted to learn, but their language level was really low. So they were too low for our trainee teachers. So what we decided to do was teach them anyway. So we set up a class, they came along on a weekly basis. Just, you know, we had the resources, we had the teachers, we didn't really have any funding for this. We still don't really have any funding for this. But we started with this one teaching group, and we never really stopped because they brought some friends along, and then that kept happening. And then we thought, well, it's been 3 months, let's continue. It's now been 8 years, And I can now officially say that we've reached more than 1,000 learners with that project, which makes me really happy. But so from the CELTA, we have these community classes, and sort of COVID changed things a little bit. So we're not face-to-face anymore, we're online. We're reaching a lot more learners across the country. And what that has turned into then is we've got community classes. We're adding to our teacher development, because I'm sure anybody who works in ESOL knows that sort of there's a little bit of a gap between CELTA training and then the ability to actually work with vulnerable adults that are coming through an ESOL system. So that's a whole other talk that I'm not going to talk about right now, but we do have that teacher development element to it. And we're looking at ways of increasing progression pathways for learners who come through to our FE and HE stuff as well. So that's kind of a broad picture. And today I'm specifically going to talk about the ESOL project that we ran that kind of brings things together, hopefully. Okay, it's going to take a little drink. Ooh. So in 2021, which feels very far away now, but also like how was all of that chaos? How was all of that far away? I don't know. But back in 2021, there was a little bit of a collaboration happening between us and some other departments in the university. We attempted a funding bid for a particular pot. That didn't work out, but a little bit later we came back and there was some Research Wales Innovation Fund funding available for kind of a trial project. So I worked with 3 other groups in the university and we put together the Pedals project, which was all about elevating digital and language skills, which is why it's Pedals. Somebody liked the propelling forward notion of that, so we went with that. And our little quarter of it was all about trying to teach ESOL in a slightly different way, to see if we could access and provide access to learning for some of those learners who were facing barriers that meant that they couldn't make it to those regular FE classrooms. This was kind of well into the pandemic at this point, so we'd already been encountering lockdowns and things like that. So there was a lot of talk about how do we kind of make sure that people can still learn. And we'd learned from the community classes that actually if you switch some of this online and you work with the third sector to make sure that people have access to Wi-Fi and access to devices, then they can actually engage in much more flexible ways. And so that was kind of part of what prompted this, really. So we funded a small project. It was a 6-month course through the RUA funding and Trinity Language Access Fund. So what Trinity allowed was to make sure that we could give them a certificate at the end. So they funded the exam fees basically for any student that got through the full course, which is great because it meant that we could make it a little bit more formalized as well, rather than the informal provision that we've been given before. So this is kind of what it looked like. And I feel like if we tried to run this year, it would be a slightly different picture than when we tried to run it in 2022. Because you'll remember that in 2022, we were not entirely sure how much face-to-face access we were going to be able to get with any learners. Were we going to be locked down? Were we not going to be locked down? And so that kind of cleared a pathway really and made it a lot easier than it would normally be to say, look, I want to teach this group online and I want to make it entirely online. But we're language teachers. We love to have those learners in the classroom as well, and they love to come to us. But what we were seeing was that a lot of the barriers to access were about physically getting to a space. So while we wanted to make sure that they had the opportunity to come to us, we didn't want to make that a compulsory element of the teaching process. So everything that was compulsory on the course, all of the tasks that were needed to be completed, all of the online live classes, everything online was live. So everything that was compulsory was available online, either in a live classroom or as self-study materials. We saw the students every day online, but we also gave them weekly opportunities to come to campus if they wanted to also be in that face-to-face space. And that was lovely because we did get some of them coming in on a regular basis, but then the others were also able to engage with everything that happened in the face-to-face class in an online version on the same day. So that worked quite well. The only limitation to that we found was that the exams had to be in person. They had to be on campus, and they had to be done in that way just because of the limitations then with the exam board. Even the online speaking exam, which was a surprise to me, but the speaking and listening exam online still had to be done on campus because it had to be done in that setting. So that meant that for one or two of our learners, they weren't able to go through the exam process, but we did internally assess them. So they seemed, that kind of worked for them. So that's what it looked like. We taught for 6 months, and it was a 20-week course. So we had kind of Easter and things in the middle. So it was a 20-week course. This was also a little bit different because usually for, as I said earlier, for learners at a certain level, it takes an academic year to get to the next one. But what we did was that we took in entry 2 level students, and we took them through ESOL entry 3, and we did it in 20 weeks. Working with them, it was a nice small group. We were able to work with them in ways to try and keep engagement as high as possible, and make sure that they had the support that they needed to reach the level that they needed to, and achieve in the exams and things like that. So yeah, they all look very happy in the photos, and that always helps. We also did this with, it was a very small pot of funding, so we did this with the support and help of our amazing volunteer teachers. So our community projects are taught by volunteers, usually fresh off our CELTA courses. So there's a very tall blonde chap in the middle of the middle photo, and that's Michael. And oh, where'd he go? Come back. He attended every single face-to-face class, as well as regular classes throughout the course. So there was myself and 2 volunteer teachers, and without them, we wouldn't have been able to teach the whole thing, I don't think. So that was amazing. And they did that as part of our community teaching award as well. So they got a bit out of that. Yeah, so that's kind of what it looked like. And I suppose the main thing you want to know, even it doesn't really matter what it looked like unless it worked. So we kind of want to have a look at what the success stories looked like then, or what was the success rate of what we had. So I'm going to start with the numbers because that's the first thing anybody ever asks for. And if anybody's read the blog, the numbers are up there as well. So I'm just popping these up on the screen for everybody to see. And again, with the water. So we had 32 potential learners come in. A few of them were a little too high for what we needed. A few were a little too low, so we referred to where we knew they'd be able to access provision. Of those 32, we were able to offer 18 places. We had 15 students enrolled. 3 of them didn't make it through the enrollment process for various reasons that we'll come on to. And then of those 15 that formally enrolled with the university on the course, 9 of them completed, which I'm very pleased about. We worked really hard with these 9. We worked really hard with all of them, but just to make sure that everybody got to where they needed to be. 5 of them achieved full awards, so they got what they need in every skill. The other 2 were the 2 who weren't able to sit the Trinity exams because of their location, and not being able to actually get to Swansea on the day. But we internally assessed them at the same, and then the other 2 achieved in at least one skill area, which was great, particularly for one guy, we'll call him Jay today. But he worked really hard, and he managed to get his speaking and listening up to where he needed it to be. So we were very pleased with that. Bless him. But I am aware that I'm probably, you know, it's a RefugEAP room. I'm probably talking to a lot of EAP teachers. And when you work in EAP, you're looking for success rates on courses that are closer to 90, maybe 95, maybe 97, I recall being the happy number. Yeah, I don't know where we got that from. The 97% pass rate, that's been the happy number for years. If you're doing that, you're doing okay. And that is significantly higher than the success rate that you're looking at in front of you. But I think even with EAP courses, but particularly with a course like this, we need to look at the people a little bit more than we need to look at the stats, and we need to look at the stories a little bit more than we look at the stats, because managing to get even 50% of a group with a background like this through courses like this is actually quite challenging. And so kind of, again, something that we'll talk about, but something to be celebrated. So we're going to shift from the numbers because they only tell part of the story. And we're going to look a little bit at some of the challenges. Now, these are not general challenges. These are specific challenges for the individuals that we did not get through the course. The first one is Ukraine. So we're back in 2022, and we lost 2 learners through that. One of them completely, just couldn't do it. Had to go back. Had a lot of stuff going on there. The other went home. So to my knowledge is still in Ukraine, but jumps into our community classes every now and then just to say hi, which is always nice. There were 2 who had COVID-related ill health, so knock on with pneumonia and that sort of stuff. We had issues with UKVI paperwork that meant that we didn't get enrolments done for learners early enough that they could engage fully. We had a learner who had been based in Swansea for, I'm going to go with at least 6 years, and was then relocated, so couldn't continue. Caring commitments that meant that, I mean, we all know how they go. But we also had a couple of learners who, I'm going to go with left for positive reasons. So they didn't complete. So there were 1 or 2 who came in really excited, really ready to do this, but it was a quite high intensity course. And they came and said, look, we want to do the community classes first. Again, let's build that up. Let's build a little bit of confidence before we get there. Despite their scores being high enough, they didn't feel quite ready, and that's fine. We also had 2 who whose language got so much better, or I'll say their language. No, their confidence in using their own language skill got so much better by sort of 9 or 10 weeks in that they'd managed to get themselves to interviews, and had got employment opportunities. And in their position, it wasn't tenable to continue studying and not take the employment opportunity that was offered to them. So they took those. So yes, challenges, but also some success stories in reasons that students don't complete. And a lot of this as well, not within our control, not within the learner's control, just stuff that they genuinely can't do anything about, and stuff that we can't do anything about, but that will impact their studies. And the difference with a course like this is that this is almost every student. It's almost every student has something going on, and sometimes you can get them through and sometimes you can't. When we're looking at EAP courses, then, I mean, when I started at Swansea, it was maybe 2 or 3 students, and out of very large cohorts. Last term, it was about 70% of the cohort were facing similar kinds of issues that we're seeing on an ESOL program. So I think the landscape is changing a little bit across the board. I don't think it's just these community projects that are seeing these issues. And so I think that's why I think that work that we're kind of doing with RefugEAP and Alex with your trauma-informed approaches to classrooms and things like that, it's going to be important across everything. But yeah, that's, again, a digression and a different talk. So I'm going to carry on. Yeah, so what I'm going to finish with a really happy story on this as well. So in addition to, I think 50% on that course progressing as well as they did was fantastic. We really fully met everything that we were trying to do. What we also saw was that putting in this little ESOL course in between the community classes that are relatively low level and the sponsored places that we're able to offer at Swansea with the help of RefugEAP and other organisations like that, and then hopefully moving up students on to scholarships. What we saw was that the ESOL provision in the middle helped to bridge that gap for learners, because when we set out with the project, we thought we were going to be running an entry one course. We thought it was going to be beginner level, but it turned out, talking to the community in 2021, at the end of 2021, that actually the gap was at entry 3. So we ran an entry 3 course. And what we saw then was that quite a high proportion of the students, it was 40% of the learners that came to us, wanted to study with Swansea because their eventual aspiration was to finish their higher education studies. And what we tend to find with government initiatives and with FE colleges and things like that is that the connection between employability and ESOL tends to be vocational. For a whole number of reasons, tends to be vocational. But if you can get universities involved in that ESOL stage, then maybe we can start widening participation and widening access to higher education for people who really want that. And maybe we don't have the potentially disheartening process of you're very highly qualified at home in your own languages, but then you go straight into courses that are sending you in a different direction. That's not for you. So as a jigsaw puzzle piece, it kind of works well in this pathway. And just to illustrate it really nicely, 2 of the students that we had on the project, one of them started in our community classes, the other one is her sister. They came along, they did the ESOL, they got a sponsored place 2 terms ago with us via RefugEAP, and now they are both in a position to start on their masters as soon as their accommodation is sorted out, which makes me very happy because now we've got a full pathway for people. So yeah, that's kind of where we're finishing that. And I think it's Q&A time if anybody's got any questions. And I think I stayed within 20 minutes, so